These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down.
Dr. Hendricks writes in The Life of Madie Hall Xuma, Black Women's Global Activism During Jim Crow and Apartheid, that when the Society for the Study of Afro-American History in Winston-Salem, Forsyth County, North Carolina, issued a call in June 1994 for community assistance with research and memorabilia for a 1995 historical calendar on Black women who, quote, made distinctive contributions to the community between the early 1900s through 1959. Madie Beatrice Hall Xuma made the list of an impressive group of women. Nearly a decade later, her name also appeared in the Wilson, North Carolina Daily Times as an educational tool for kindergarten through 8th grade students in a section called, quote, Mind Designs. After posing the question, is there an important or influential African American from North Carolina whose name begins with an X? The answer was Madie Hall Xuma. She lived most of her life in Winston-Salem and rose to national prominence in 1941 when she overcame bitter opposition to open a YWCA for women in South Africa. Several of the facts were incorrect, but by promoting Hall Xuma's activism in South Africa, the feature transnationalized her story. Professor Hendricks goes on to contextualize Miss Madie, writing that Hall Xuma had been propelled onto the global stage in South Africa in 1940, and by 1954 had made such an impact in the country that a representative of the Department of Bantu Education referred to her as, quote, the mother of Africa. Her presence in South Africa, he insisted, has meant a new day for our dark-skinned fellow men of Africa, and he declared, quote, her name will not be forgotten in the annals of our day. Indeed, more than 60 years later, South Africans still revered her. The Cape Town, South Africa Weekend Argus contended in 2017, quote, if South Africa owes its constitutional democracy to the African National Congress and its heroic struggles, then the ANC owes its progressive outlook and gender sensibilities to a legion of its women cadres who, for years, have weaved formidable foundational threads upon whose pivot this progressive culture is hinged. These women are amongst the best minds that the country has ever nestled, and, quote, none of them suffered fools as they formidably held their own in a patriarchal and racist society. Ultimately, they could put any man to intellectual shame and in fact stand head and shoulders above most men. Hall Xuma was on the list that included an impressive array of South African women like Sophie Mpama, Ruth First, Ruth Mompati, Bertha Gxowa, Ellen Kuzwayo, Lucy Mvubelo, Gertrude Shope, and Winnie Mandela. Hall Xuma, however, is virtually unknown to the general public in part because she has been ignored in much of the historical literature, particularly by American scholars. South African scholars fare far better, but they have compartmentalized nearly every aspect of her life to such a degree that they have not been able to craft a broad conceptual framework that adequately demonstrates how centered she was in the historic issues facing the world during and after World War II, and the pivotal role she played in the dynamic interplay between women's groups globally after the war. Today, we present Professor Hendricks' very important contribution to expanding our historical consciousness as we explore the life of Madie Hall Xuma. Wanda A. Hendricks is a distinguished professor emerita of history at the University of South Carolina. Professor Hendricks has served as the National Director of the Association of Black Women Historians and Senior Editor of the 3-volume Black Women in America 2nd edition published by Oxford University Press. She currently is an editor for the UIP's Women, Gender, and Sexuality in American History series, and her other books include Gender, Race, and Politics in the Midwest, Black Club Women in Illinois, and the first biography of Black activist and intellectual Fannie Berrier Williams, titled Fannie Berrier Williams, Crossing the Borders of Region and Race. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Listen intently, think critically, act accordingly. Enjoy the program. Professor Hendricks, I would like to thank you for taking the time to spend with us to talk about a very important but not talked about enough person in global history, Black women's history, Black women's organizing and activism, Madie Hall Xuma. Thank you for taking the time to join us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, and especially to talk about Hall Xuma. As I've said to many people, I am as fascinated by her as others who learn about her are. She is. It's unfortunate that most people don't know who she is. She was one of the most prominent women of her generation, and it's where she just sort of got lost in history. So,
coming out of Winston Salem and Winston Salem State University, Teachers College, right?
Salem,
Slater's,
North Carolina.
yes, right. And we often, as thinkers, as folk who are interested, the breadth and depth of our histories is just so astounding, especially when we read your book. We come to the context, and as we get your book, the fascinating and multiple levels of history that is surrounding this very important, unique figure in Black history and Black world history becomes very important. And you do a very wonderful job in really situating, Madie Hall Xuma in this global conversation. And because of that, let's start with a basic question. You recount this story. I've heard you, I've read it in the preface of your book, but how did Madie Hall Xuma come to your intellectual eye and your historical eye? But also there's some personal connections here as well. Could you talk a little bit about how you come to this particular project?
This project has been 40 years in the making. Well, 40 plus years now. In the making. I didn't know that I was going to come to this project in the way that it has now appeared. But I met Madie Hall Xuma when I was a young woman, a teenager, and a young woman, because I used to visit Winston-Salem, North Carolina, quite often. I had two great aunts, my Aunt Alma, my Aunt Nola, and then my cousin Barbara and my Aunt Alma's husband, John Cardwell. They were in Winston-Salem, and I would go up there. Sometimes I'd ride the Trailways bus up there. Other times, Aunt Alma, once or twice, Aunt Alma came to Charlotte and picked me up, which is a whole nother story about her driving and all that stuff. But anyway, she wasn't the best driver, but just going up to Winston-Salem and visiting with them. So, and it became sort of a ritual for me. Even when I moved away from North Carolina, I would always still go back. They lived long lives. Aunt Alma was like 95 when she passed away, 95 or 96, and Aunt Nola was like 94 or so. But anyway, visiting them, I on Stadium Drive where they lived, which was actually what became, I think, some of Winston-Salem State University's property. So Winston-Salem State figures prominently in this early on, and they sold their property and moved to Cameron Avenue. They built two houses next door to each other. The houses are still there. The house, there's a house on the corner, and then there was, which is where Aunt Alma lived, and then there was a house next to it, which is where Aunt Nola lived, and my cousin Barbara, and then there was a house next to them that had been there since the late 1930s. Miss Madie Hall Xuma had built that house, and she lived there, but I didn't know who she was. Like I said, she was, as I say in the preface of the book, she was a lady that sort of came out on her porch. Look, and it's a little porch, it wasn't a big porch, but she would come out in the morning, and my Aunt Nola and Aunt Alma, would say, "Good morning, Madie." And so she became Miss Madie to me. because I was younger, so I didn't get to call her Madie. But she became Miss Madie to me. And that's all I knew about her. It was just the waving in the mornings. And then sometimes a lot of the widows, they were Black women, their husbands had died. Quite a few of them, Aunt Alma and Aunt Nola knew, and they would walk down the streets in the morning when I would go visit. And I'd usually stay for a week or two at a time when I was up there. And every once in a while, they'd walk down the street and they'd talk about the weather, some news event, and then they'd go on their way. And a few times, a few of them would actually come up on the porch, particularly Aunt Nola's porch, and they would plop themselves down on a chair, and we'd have a good little women's chat. I call them sessions now, and that's how I talk about them in the book. And one of these times, Miss Madie came over, something she had not done before, and she plopped herself down in a chair, and she started, and somehow, I still don't remember how, it's been so long ago, Africa came up. I don't know if it was the introduction to her or what, but Africa came up. She started talking about South Africa. And I just so happened to have taken a class on South African history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Because I was a public school teacher and I needed some intellectual stimulation. So I enrolled in a graduate class and would take classes at night. And so I was intrigued. I'm sitting in Winston Salem, and I was like, okay, it was clear she had been in South Africa. I was like, what the heck was she doing in South Africa? But I wasn't sophisticated enough to really ask the germane questions. And I didn't know what to ask her. And so when she left and when we went in the house and I asked Mom, no, what was Miss Madie's last name? Well, she couldn't pronounce it. She got so exasperated that I remember, because she kept trying to come up and, and then she finally said, well, she married an African. And that was like definitive. And I'm like, okay, so what does that mean? And so she went to Africa, she married an African. I was like, okay, but that still didn't tell me what her name was. And then I would later discover because I had written a paper on Afro-American Xuma while I was in my South African history class, not knowing that the woman next door there, whose name my Aunt Nola, last name my Aunt Nola couldn't pronounce, was that woman. Some of her correspondence I had already read. So, and that was when they did microfilm and microfiche and all that. So it wasn't digitized then, and that I'd actually read it and not having a clue who she was. So that's how I came to it. I knew I was going to do something with it. Even 40 years ago, I just didn't know what. And it wasn't until I became a graduate student that I started contemplating things. So I started saving stuff. And then it became, I wrote my first biography, because this is my third book, but I wrote my first biography of another woman who was prominent in her day that people forgot, Fannie Berry Williams. And I will say, had I not written that biography, I probably could not have written Madie Hall Xuma, because biography is such a difficult genre to do. And I had a hard time doing the Fannie Berry Williams one. And so, but it taught me what kinds of questions I should ask, or how I could shape it. It's shaped very differently than Fannie Berry Williams is, but it also has some similarities, especially the geography of them both. So, except that Madie Hall Xuma is a global geography in a way that Fannie Berry Williams was not. So that's why I say it's been 40 years in the making, but I feel like I had to do something else, right? The first book, which was on Illinois Black women, I was introduced to Fannie Berry Williams, and then I could come to Madie Hall Xuma with that knowledge and not be so afraid of it, because I don't believe that I could have done it had I not already written a biography.
I don't want our listeners to lose sight that you briefly mentioned, we'll go back to, you had already did some work on A.B. Xuma. You'd already wrote a paper on A.B. Xuma. So, those who believe in divine providence and those who believe in certain things, ancestral work is happening here, right? So this project, of course, is moving, to the point now that you've produced, this wonderful and very, very fascinating and in-depth historical biography of an important, again, figure. Let's set the context. you open the book and you really kind of situate this in the case of in your family coming to Winston, but also in juxtaposition or in simultaneously as Miss Madie's family, right? You know, set the context of Winston that leads to the development where we have this global figure that we're talking about. So set the context of Winston as you know, as this global tobacco empire is developing right after the Civil War. Black folk are moving to the cities.
Winston-Salem was like a lot of these southern cities as they grew, and particularly post-Civil War, and especially during the Industrial Age. It produced some major figures in some major white, I call them oligarchs, because that's literally what they were. They really controlled the city in multiple ways. And of course, the one who came out on top was R.J. Reynolds, and that's the one that we all know. You know, there were others as well, but you know, the Hayneses, for example, Haynes Hosiery. But the R.J. Reynolds would really be the one that sets Winston-Salem, on a global map. He is, as he's building up Winston-Salem and helping to build up Winston-Salem and riches in the United States, as well as around the world, and becoming such a major global figure in the tobacco industry itself, and he's engaged in this global commerce. At the same time, there are a groups of African Americans who are building up Black Winston. Now, they can only do it with the help of the oligarchs, right? The Hayneses, the R.J. Reynolds, et cetera. And on a separate track, there are also women who are also engaged, and they're engaged in this public arena, in some ways very different from men. But I also found Winston-Salem fascinating because you also had women who were also engaged in the economic market in very interesting ways, buying properties, selling them, like Madie's mother, because she was an entrepreneur. So there are these sort of multiple economic tracks that are going on, but the oligarchs are still controlling, the white oligarchs are still controlling everything. This is also at a time of Jim Crow. Madie Hall Xuma is born in 1894. Keep in mind that the Plessy v. Ferguson decision hadn't come yet, but it's coming. And so she's a young girl, and once it comes, she is now living under what we now know as called Jim Crow. Not saying that it didn't exist in some form before, but we know the draconian measures that come out of it. And so Winston-Salem is following the track of other southern cities. So African Americans who could vote are no longer going to be able to vote, or they're going to have very difficult time voting. The registrars stopped voting, registering them, these African American men, because women didn't have access. But the men who were able to vote will pretty much lose that right. So what they will do is they will then turn their attention to continuing to build up Black Winston. So people like Simon Atkins, he comes to town as well, because all of this is happening in those late 1880s and to the 1890s. And so, they're building up of industrial America, which I find, and I'll deviate a little bit, because I find fascinating when we talk about industrialization, we never talk about Black people as industrialists. We always talk about the white oligarchs or the white people who created, quote, America or the South, or built up, like the R.J. Reynolds factory, et cetera, as industrialists, but we don't refer to Black people as industrialists, which is exactly what they were. Mm. They were in the industrial era. They were thinking about education. So Simon Atkins, hence helping to create what would become Winston-Salem State University. It starts out as Slater, but he would help create what would become Winston-Salem State University with the help of R.J. Reynolds and some of the other white oligarchs. Madie Hall Xuma's father, H.H. Hall, will also be a part of helping to build up Black Winston by owning, creating theaters, owning property. He and some other African-American men will create a consortium, and they will purchase these commercial properties, and then they'll sell them later. And so they're making money in the sort of commercial market. He is also, buying properties too, and they'll buy their house that the family will grow up in on 7th Street. But he will later turn the sort of family property entrepreneurship over to his wife, because he figures out that she's really good at this. And so she has that, that kind of capacity to really, buying and selling property and making money for the family. So they have a partnership. It's not just a marriage, but it's also a real partnership between the two of them. Their children, like I said, Madie is their second child, but the first girl. She's going to be watching all of this happen. And so she gets to see this entrepreneurship in her family with her mother and father. She gets to see that her father graduated from medical school at Charlotte University. So the historically Black colleges play a central role in this book, especially at the beginning. Even from Alfred Xuma, because he's going to graduate from Tuskegee. The Charlotte University, Winston-Salem State, all of these are going to play central roles in the lives of all of these African Americans, or many of them who come to Winston-Salem. And so her father is, central to this, and her mother's going to become central as well. And then, like I said, Madie's watching all of this, and they are in conversation, if you will, with the white oligarchs and their wives. So her father and some of his friends will purchase property from R.J. Reynolds. He's got to sell them something, he and Catherine Reynolds. And so they're engaged. So they see this interracial cooperation as a good thing. And they see it as a way to build up Black Winston. And so Winston-Salem becomes this major place in North Carolina. It actually becomes the largest city in North Carolina with the Black population in Winston-Salem becomes the largest number of African Americans, a city with the largest number of African Americans by 1920. Outpacing Charlotte, which was really weird for me to find out. But then by 1930, Charlotte overtakes it again. But it becomes the place that has the most African Americans in North Carolina. Now, that's because so many African Americans are going to Winston-Salem. The Black population in Winston-Salem actually outnumbered the white population in Winston-Salem by the turn of the century, by 1900. I didn't know any of this. And so there are more African Americans in Winston-Salem than there are whites by 1900. The white population will continue to grow, and eventually there will be more whites in Winston-Salem. Nevertheless, the Black population continues to grow. They are building up this whole Black community. So they have their own schools, they're Jim Crow schools, but they have their own schools, public schools. They have Slater Institute, which was one of the better, best schools in North Carolina, or would become at that time. It is going to change names several times. It's going to be the Institute, and then it's going to become the normal school, et cetera. And then ultimately it'll become Winston-Salem State University. So the Black people helped to do that. They had to have the help and the support and get permission from the white people, but African Americans did that. So they actually had their own conclave. They had their own movie theaters, they had their own businesses, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what Madie comes out of. There's also the social and cultural life. And Madie Hall Xuma, Madie Hall at the time, becomes such a major part of that. So she helps to create the Black YWCA that had to get permission from the white Y in order to exist. And so she helps to create that. She's a singer, she's plays the piano, and she had learned how to play the piano from a young age. And so she is very engaged in cultural dynamics of Winston-Salem, particularly in the Black community, but the white community was also interested as well. So they would come to a lot of the shows that they would often having them at churches, at schools. They put on these major events. She also put on shows that she will take to South Africa, by the way, and she would that skill to South Africa to raise money in the Black community as well. So she's been watching her parents, what they've been doing, and because she believed in service, and part of that was her connection to the AME Zion Church, or African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. The church for her family wasn't simply just an institution that she went to on Sundays. It was their life. It was part of it. It was instilled in all the children to do service to the community. And that was always her life and the central reason for her being. And she will take that to South Africa as well. So hence the YWCA made sense. The Young Women's Christian Association, that Christian, it becomes its operative word here. And she was not unlike a lot of African-American women like Mary McLeod Bethune, all these very prominent women, Dorothy Height, that we'll come to know. All of these women were also YWCA women, or Y women, as I call them. And so Madie is following in a tradition that made sense. And it also is connected to that Christian ideology, and the Y was also a service organization. So, but it was also a space for women. It was very feminized space. So it is Winston-Salem was the happening place. Marcus Garvey's going to come there in the 1920s, and fills up this the place, the standing room only. They will have all kinds of shows that will come there. I learned a lot working on this about Winston-Salem and also about Southern Black culture. In that post-Civil War period, and the ways in which African Americans themselves were building up these Southern cities as industrialists, if you will. I mean, unless we come up with another term for them. And it's unfortunate that we don't see them in that way, because we talk about, Tulsa. How did that happen? We talk about Durham. How did that happen? And it was these African Americans who were building it up, understanding that they're living in Jim Crow, understanding how they're going to have to deal with the white oligarchs because they had the money, knowing that they're going to have to buy land from them, probably figure out how to negotiate, how to get money up from them. And in some sense, to be mindful of what their place always was under Jim Crow. And as long as they sort of could navigate that and, quote, didn't step out of bounds, the white community, for the most part, was willing to help them. Slater Hospital, on the other hand, had a murky history. It started out with lots of fanfare, but it didn't last. But the hospital in Durham that was created, it actually did. It was, it continued to function, but the Slater Hospital didn't last, what was it? It was less than a decade. So that is, that was a tale in and of itself, and I wanted to tell it. And it was a little hard because okay, where do you stick this? It's like, that's a part of the upbuilding of Black Winston-Salem. And the failure of it. Madie watched that as well. And if you, and then throughout the book, you'll see her not make that mistake again. That she saw it, and she knew that you had to be a part of a larger coalition. You couldn't just be dependent on one oligarch or even two of them, but you needed to have a federation or some sort of major coalition to build any kind of lasting institutions. So it is, she learned a lot from just simply being in that environment, the churches there, and more churches will come from every denomination, but it was to the AME Zion that they really, the family was tied to and would remain tied to until their deaths. So.
There's a lot there. Thank you for that. And it's a very important because, just to kind of push, it seems to me, reading this, but also looking at reading your book and talking about, how, Black Winston or Black communities, there is a clear understanding that when we look at Madie Hall Xuma's father, or Miss Madie's father, mother, even looking at their development, they're very clear, as you say, about, Jim Crow tightening, race riots are happening in Winston, as well, even before the 1919 is happening, which, you make a very important point about that, this race riot that happens, or these instances of violence that's happening before you even get to what Du Bois calls the Red Summer, right? This notion, Plessy versus Ferguson is happening. It seems to me, in one of the stories that you tell about Miss Madie's mother and how she begins to make money, and the first thing that she tells her is to save a little, but then use the rest to help people out. basically is almost like give it away in the context of helping build the community. So it seems to me that there is a clear, some the term now is mutual aid or things like that, but I'm looking at the development of community and the centering of Black community utilizing these particular formations, whether it's the oligarchs are using these formations to their benefit, but there still is this notion that I would probably put in the tradition of folk like Callie House, this notion of a community, this notion of we're going to utilize, we're very clear about the means within which the environment we're in, but we're utilizing these things in order to center the community. And that reading that's what I really, is that a good reading of reading this particular history of what you kind of outlined here? Because it's a very rich history. It's cultural. Black cultural life is centered under a notion of a communalism or something. At the same time, very aware of the Jim Crow and the structures within which they're developing. Your response, I don't know, because that's what I was getting when I read.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. And that's one of the things I was truly trying to convey. Good. They are living, you're right about the violence. You've got the the death of one brother and then the arrest of another brother. Right after maybe 2 years after she, or 1 year, 1 or 2 years after she's born. Of course, she was too young to remember that, but that was a part of Winston Salem's history. You're going to have the mayor talking about getting a Gatling gun. That was like the machine gun of that era, so he could mow down the Black people, because they were they wouldn't do what the sheriff and the rifleman and all, and the judge told them to do. And then they're gonna guard their own people. They're getting on the train, they're waiting for them. They've made some contact with the people in Greensboro. So it was a display of, in some ways, that disrupted Jim Crow. On the other hand, it also tells us how committed that they were to their community, that they were willing to be arrested, which is what happened to a number of them. So you got that violence. Then you got the violence, after World War I. You've got this, huge eruption in Winston-Salem. But then you have African Americans coming out, the powers that be in the African American community saying there was no race riot in Winston-Salem. They blamed it on class because what they saw was and understood what they needed to say. The good white people, R.J. Reynolds is dead by now, but it's white Catherine, she's still there. And then they're going to be, the other oligarchs are still alive and his money is still flowing. He may be dead, but it's still flowing. And his brother is there as well. So, but they recognized that they needed to say, this is really about class. It was the, poor white people who run around and do all this other stuff. They're the ones who caused this. It wasn't basically the oligarchs, because we understand that the oligarchs are on our side. They didn't do this. They didn't kill 5 people. And so it's a remarkable way that they figured out how to navigate it, to navigate a world in which they knew whether it was the poor white people or people who have middling class or whoever, whether it was, or if that those people could have done it, but also the oligarchs could have done it to them. And actually they knew that if the oligarchs did it, it was going to be way worse, right? They didn't have to be the Ku Klux Klan. They could have done something way worse to them, but they didn't. And so they come out in the newspaper, by 1918, and they are quick about it. There was no race riot in Winston-Salem, when in reality there was, because all the newspapers picked it up. There really was a race riot. So, but we're not, well, in some ways we're seeing some of the, 2023, we're seeing some of this, but we couldn't put ourselves, for most of us, who were born in the 20th century, we couldn't put ourselves in there other than sort of make a comparison to the civil rights movement. But the walls of Jim Crow are coming down in the civil rights movement. We couldn't see what it was like to have lived under the thumb of people who could go get a call for a Gatling gun, right? That they could mow you down. So yes, I agree. They saw themselves as a real community, the good, bad, and ugly. There were a lot of poor people in Winston-Salem. They were coming to Winston-Salem by the train loads, and R.J. Reynolds was utilizing that labor, that cheap labor. And he made his money off the backs of that cheap labor. He also made his money off the backs of cheap white labor. And nobody really talks about that except for, some scholars who've been writing about that labor and what that meant, and that their monies, this family is still living off of that money. That's how much money he had. And I probably can't spend it all. So in their lifetimes, and how many generations are we removed from this now? So yeah, but the Black community, they may not have had as much money as R.J. Reynolds had, but it's clear they had money and they had something and they had property. But they also understood that the reason for them being, because I've tried to figure out, I was like, why did Madie keep doing all of this? That I know her mother taught her about service, and she watched her father. He was in the YMCA, and her mother and father did all kinds of things for the church and for other people. But at any point in time, she could have stepped outside of that. But then I had to realize that's all she knew. From the time she was young, her mother had inculcated her with this idea, and her father, about service. And then her church, the AME Zion Church, sort of reinforced it. That's all she knew. It's almost as if she didn't know how not to do it. Mm-hmm. So, and there were lots of people like her in Winston-Salem. So you gave back to the community, because who were you not to do that? What did that make you not to give back to your community that helped to produce who you were, and in many ways helped to give you what you have? Because her parents, when they were buying and selling these properties, they were renting them out to Black people. Mm-hmm. So they understood the nature of what was happening as well. When she was educated at Slater, that was something Simon Atkins helped, did. Simon Atkins, with the help from R.J. Reynolds, they created Slater Hospital. The Slater Institute. And so she recognized that. Even the hospital, her father was one of the Black doctors. They had white doctors, but they also had Black doctors there. So he was there. So they understood that everything that they did, all of it gave them something back. And so the service wasn't just one way. It was an understanding of it and what their role was. One could argue it was sort of the talented 10th ideology, but I think it goes way much further than that. And you can't quite just reduce it to the talented 10th, because in some ways, the talented 10th ideology is very class-based. And they were upper class. But they also understood that their role, they were clear about what their role was in this life. And so they were always giving back. Also keep in mind, there were no social service agencies as we know them. Mm-hmm. Now, there were always agencies, but there were no safety nets. There were, whatever people think about the social service agencies today, the government has them both in states as well as, on the federal level. And then they're the ones, the private dollars. And so most of any kind of any help that you receive, it was primarily from private dollars and private donors. So we must remember what I think we forget, how bad it was for African Americans, even at the turn of the century, at 1900, that far removed from the Civil War. And so when the YWCA gave out baskets of food with grits and whatever else, flour, etc. These are major deals for people because there were so many poor people there. And Madie and her family recognized that. And her father got a bird's eye view of it because he was a doctor. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He got to see those patients who came in and they couldn't pay him or whatever, or the people who went to the hospital and they couldn't pay for surgeries or whatever they needed. He had a bird's eye view of that, and she did too. and her other siblings. Her, I think, and her older brother probably more so than the others. But over time, her sister next to her, Willie Kennedy, also got a bird's eye view of it. But they saw things, but they too were inculcated with this notion of service as well. So I agree wholeheartedly with you about this sense of community, helping people. That doesn't mean there weren't problems. That doesn't mean that they didn't disagree and that they didn't talk about how, well, okay, maybe we shouldn't have done that, or, just because so-and-so has the money to do blah, 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 doesn't mean that that's the right thing to do. So there were all kinds of discussions about those things. And yeah, they talked about the, people who shot people and embarrassed them, embarrassing the race. They talked about all those things. But ultimately, they all understood that they were part of a larger community. And part of that was because, or a large part of that was because they were African American, growing up and being a part of the Jim Crow system. Mm-hmm. So they banded together. Yeah.
There was this synergy between a racial consciousness and a class consciousness, but also a defection and what I'm gonna call Cabral would call a class suicide element that is happening, that's happening there as well. S.G. Atkins, her father. So not only is this notion of service and community being developed and refined, and again, I'm glad and I want our listeners, we have a number of listeners, and so there are issues, there's some conflicts that just comes up, but the importance of this story, the keeping the story intact, the kernel of the story is the community, the class defection and suicide, the racial and class consciousness that is being developed. At the same time, and we'll this is when we can add in S.G. Atkins, there's service and education, right? So there is a very clear understanding that education is being developed not only for an individual advancement, but also community advancement. Yes, I am individually making certain achievements. However, I'm attempting to provide ways and through organizations, because Miss Madie, is developing. She's engaged in a lot of activism, cultural development, educational development. She goes, S.G. Atkins, talk about the relationship between, the Atkins family and her family. Her father taught at Slater at the time. I think he taught physiology and biology or those type of things. Talk a little bit about that merging as well, because that becomes very important, particularly when she gets to New York after she's denied being a doctor, right?
Right. Well, let me first say, Stephanie Shaw, or Professor Stephanie Shaw at Ohio University, had talked about this earlier in her own book, and I referenced that because it became clearer to me, because I read Stephanie's book and a long time ago, but I hadn't really, it's what a woman ought to be and to do. And it clicked sort of. It wasn't until I was actually doing Madie Hall Xuma that I really got it. That your education, okay, it was yours. You went to school and you were supposed to be, to learn something, but it wasn't all yours. You always took it back to share with your community, or you did something with it. You didn't just own it and then you just went, and were frivolous and never did anything with it. So it was important for these young women like her, and especially, and of course her father, for them to bring that back to the community. So you're right. Her father became, as what we now know, is probably the first Black doctor. Now, somebody might find another one, but he was probably the first Black doctor in Winston-Salem. And so he would join forces with Simon Atkins. When I talked about Slater Hospital, we had, by then you also got several other Black doctors who have also now come to town. And so you've got like 2 or 3 Black doctors on the Slater board with these white doctors. Simon Atkins was leading the charge to get the money for it. And so they're all in developing this Black hospital because they realize how important it is, how important health is. Keep in mind, all of this is happening around the same time as Darlene Clark Hine talks about the development of the nursing programs, the hospitals. You'll see Providence Hospital in Chicago. And so there's a context here. There's a larger national history here. So they're not happening in isolation. And so you'll start seeing them, all these Black hospitals coming to be in these nurse training programs. They'll have one, that'll come to be in Colombia, in the last decade of the 19th century into the early decades of the 20th century, because they recognize that they're thinking about health. Keep in mind too that you're going to get, Booker T. Washington's National Health Week in these health programs. So Tuskegee is helping to lead that charge as well. So they are education for all of them. Simon Atkins shows us this. He's at, he goes to Livingstone College, and it is possible that he actually met H.H. Hall in Salisbury, because he was from Salisbury. It's possible, I couldn't find it, but it's possible that he met him there. But Simon Atkins is at Livingstone College and becomes, a major player in North Carolina politics and the cultural development of Winston-Salem, and also the educational development once the people in Winston-Salem realize that, he is who he is, and they recognize, something good when they see it. And so they lure him there. And R.J. Reynolds is playing a part in all of this. So in Simon Atkins, he becomes a national figure. I've got him sitting on a board with Ida B. Wells Barnett. Mm-hmm. And nobody talks about him in that way. Mm-hmm. And so they're connected to this national community as well. Like a lot of African Americans, particularly prominent African Americans, they're all sort of interconnected in all kinds of ways all across the country. So these groups of people, particularly H.H. Hall, Simon Atkins, and there are a whole host of others who are, as I say, are building up Black Winston. So the educational system, they would start with that. Then they move, they're going to do the hospital. In the meantime, they're also opening up their own banks, savings and loans. They're building, they're helping, convincing and R.J. Reynolds to build, Black housing communities there. And then Simon Atkins, Columbian Heights or Columbia Heights, I've seen it spelled, written several different ways. So there's a prominent Black housing community. And so they are, expanding, and then they'll begin to continue to expand in commercial properties. Hence, the Rex Theater, so that people can go to the theater to see the movies that are coming to town. So they're joining the 20th century. You're watching history in motion. What was fascinating to me is that they were all started getting cars. And so they wrote about it in a newspaper, who had a Chevrolet, who had a this, who had a that. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And who could drive, right? Because then you're talking about, because they're moving from horse and buggy to the cars, and so you the Model T, and so who in town has them. So you're getting to see Winston-Salem itself move from the dirt roads and start thinking about paving things, and how it's developing, thinking about plumbing and what is that going to mean, who gets the plumbing first, etc. So they are in on all of this development because they are connected to the very prominent white men and women. And Madie is watching all of this as well as she is growing up. And so she, of course, will go to Shaw, just like her dad. But unfortunately, the medical school on the campus of Shaw is, going to cease to exist by 1920. And so she won't be able to go there. But yeah, she gets denied being a doctor because she's a girl, which is, a part of the gendered narrative of Black women's lives, gendered and race narrative of Black women's lives. But she didn't let that stop her. So she becomes an entrepreneur herself. She and her sister go into business with this dress shop. And I suspect she did some other things. I just couldn't find them. But I suspect that she did a whole lot of other things. But she was always busy raising money for the community with the programs that she put on at these churches, at the Y. so that that could be funneled back into the community. And keep in mind that the YWCA, Black YWCA women, were the ones who helped to create the Black Library in Winston-Salem. So they were the movers and shakers behind that. They had a white library, and they started raising money to buy books, or at least to get people to donate books at first, because they didn't have any money, and then they started raising money. And eventually the white library connected itself and, created a Black library. And it was initially under the auspices of the YWCA. So, like you're right. Education was important because they understood if they could inculcate the, people who were being educated with this idea of service to their community, they could then go out in the community. I mean, sort of similar to what we all do today. It's just that I think we don't see it the way in which we see ourselves today. But in a whole lot of ways, it was more important for them at the time. And in so many ways, so much more powerful because they were only, a generation or two removed from slavery. Her father had been born in slavery. Her mother had been born right after slavery ended. And so he had actually been born in slavery. Simon Atkins was born in slavery. And so you see them by that last, they go and get educated in the 1880s, 70s, and 80s. And then by the 1890s, you're beginning to see the full measure of them and what they're about to do, and how they build up Black communities and within that Jim Crow system.
I'd be remiss not to talk about, even the connection, Simon Green, Anna Julia Cooper, and, and the connections there. S.G. Atkins is on the board of the American Negro Academy with Du Bois and Crummell. And
Fannie Gary Williams' husband was also in that as well. S. Lane Williams. Yeah.
That's right.
All these connections. Yeah, there are.
In the midst of all of this, there's a flu pandemic that is looming. Right, this is happening. Flu is happening, and in the midst of all of this, she meets Mary McLeod Bethune, right? So even the history that you've mapped out now, you can move in a whole intellectual biography of the development, the political intellectual biography of all of these folk and how there was these cross-fertilization of ideas more so than the dominant narrative gives credit to. A lot of times there is these divisions, and like you said, there's a focus on Miss Madie's social lighter, looking at her as then eventually just being A.B. Zuma's wife, as opposed to there's a history here that develops and really inculcates in Miss Madie. Talk about her relationship or her meeting, Mary McLeod Bethune, because that becomes very important. And I think around the same time, she's also, she goes to Florida, then she goes to Virginia, then she goes back to Winston. And in the midst of all of this, she goes to her dad, and he's like, no, you can't be a doctor. Women can't be a doctor, So that particular period becomes important because that, it seems to me, was that pivot. She had what she saw for herself, but then it seemed to be that pivot moved into a bigger calling. It seems to be, she becomes the African-American mother of a nation, right? She goes to South Africa. Would you say that period and meeting Mary McLeod Bethune, because Mary McLeod Bethune becomes important later on when she goes to South Africa as well? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, let me say first, you're right, and I need to come back to it because she reveals later to Alfred B. Zuma in one of her letters that she actually had wanted to get to Africa in the 1920s, right? So, but you don't know that until you get to the South Africa, when she's writing him letters, actually is going to, finally say that she's going to marry him. So you're right about that, but most people won't know that until they get to the third part of the book, and that is the South Africa part. And that's because I didn't know it until I read that letter. I was like, okay, she was thinking about this in the early 1920s, right? So, I also have to say, it was weird writing all of this at the very same time that we were in a pandemic in the 21st century. here I am talking about the pandemic from, 1918. And I was home in it, writing about this. And so that was weird. We're also in a period of time where, the race-based sort of heightened race interest and heightened race baiting has come to the fore in a way that we haven't seen it in a long time. So we're in the midst of that. While I was writing about the race riot in Winston-Salem in 1918, just after, the war is gonna end. So it was an odd space for me. And you can look at it all kinds of ways that, maybe she was there and she told me, and it was gonna happen anyway. But I do find it fascinating that I was writing about that. But yes, Madie Hall Xuma is affected by, Madie Hall at the time, she is affected by the 1918 pandemic across the world.
Mm-hmm.
It killed thousands and thousands of people. Now, of course, we have now, I think around the world, we've surpassed the number of people who died, which is mind-boggling in and of itself from 1918. And here we are, we call ourselves so much more advanced. But anyway, her family was afflicted, and she was, that she ended up getting sick. And they sent her to Florida, and apparently Florida, and I said, okay, I need to find out about Florida. It's like, no, you don't. You just, no, don't get sidetracked, because I kept getting sidetracked a lot. The focus has to be on her. You don't have to find out what's going on in Florida and why Florida was the place that they sent her. I do know that they have friends there. I know the family has friends there. But they sent her to Florida to recuperate. And so she stopped teaching, left her teaching position and sent her there. Now, she had a relative from South Carolina who actually died because he contracted pneumonia, and he actually, the pandemic affected him so much. He ultimately died. So their family had been affected by it. And so she's sick. The father sends her to Florida to recuperate. So she was supposed to come back. But she decided while she was there, she would stay, in part because she meets this woman by the name of Mary McLeod Bethune. They happen to be living at the same boarding house or place or home. And so she's down there, as she recounts it, she's playing the piano. Mary McLeod Bethune comes downstairs and says, I didn't know you played the piano, or something to that effect. And anyway, in their conversation, Mary McLeod Bethune says, I got to school and the music teacher's gone, blah, blah, blah. Would you, have you thought it, do you think you could come and play for us? Da, 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 da. So she accepts Mary McLeod Bethune's invitation. And so she ends up staying in Florida way longer than she intended. And, but she learns to truly, as she said, she really loves Mary McLeod Bethune. She loves her tenacity. She loves the fact that Mary McLeod Bethune was so committed to the community that Mary McLeod Bethune, another one of understanding how you are able to navigate Jim Crow or and get money out of oligarchs, whether they're national oligarchs or they're local ones. And so the Rockefeller money, and Mary McLeod Bethune was able to navigate that stream of income, and so they sang, she got the children to sing melodies, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, so those Negro spirituals. And so you had these white, as we now know, a lot of whites like coming to hear, African Americans singing these. Madie Hall Xuma did the same thing to raise money. So for Black and white audiences. So I believe Madie Hall Xuma also learned another lesson. Just as I said, she learned something from her mother about service and commitment to the community. I believe from Mary McLeod Bethune, she learned something else. Mm-hmm. And that is, how do you get, to create a school, and how do you keep it functioning? And so she watched her get Rockefeller money, that they came to hear the children sing. They wrote a check, a big check, she said, on that very day, the day that they were there. And Mary McLeod Bethune was responsible for that. And, because she knew how, as Madie called her, she was a go-getter. So she knew how to do that. So she was learning that. And they became lifelong friends. Now, they also had some disagreements, but they became lifelong friends. And as you say, Mary McLeod Bethune, in the letters that they have, she has a letter from Mary McLeod Bethune who's going to invite her to come when she's in the United States after she goes to South Africa, to come to Washington, D.C. when the National Council of Negro Women is having their annual conference. And she wants Madie there. By then, Madie is a major figure, and had, Bertha Gxowa had been president of the African National Congress, et cetera. So, but Mary McLeod Bethune would write to her friend and ask her, to come to this meeting. And it was held in the United States, and it was mostly Americans, but they also had this sort of international audience. So I think they had somebody from Liberia and other people. So they were very much engaged. And it tells us that the National Council of Negro Women was not simply an American organization. And a number of scholars are looking at that now, and I think somebody's writing a book about this. I know there's a couple of articles that have been written. And Mary McLeod Bethune's reach across the Atlantic and, around the world. And Madie Hall Xuma plays a role in that because she is connected to Mary McLeod Bethune, and they are in correspondence. So there is that. And then there is the Madie Hall Xuma or Madie Hall learning how to navigate the educational system. So she decided if she couldn't be a doctor, first she defied her mother and father, right? So she had left Shaw early and got a normal school certificate. Her mother and father wanted her to get her degree. Her mom got a normal school certificate as well, and she taught school. And then when she married, she stopped. Her father, graduated from, medical school at Shaw. And so they had high hopes for her. She was influenced by her friends and other young women at school, and she just got that 2-year normal school degree. We now know that she will, in the 1930s, regret that. And she had always lived with it, and she'll go back to school. Hence, she'll go back to Winston Salem State and then to Columbia University to get her master's degree. So she is going to complete that journey. Well, it was called Winston Salem Teachers College, I think, in the 1930s. Mm-hmm. So she is going to complete that journey. And then she'll go to Columbia and meet Alfred, and there is in New York City is where she will meet Alfred B. Xuma. But the 1920s, I think we tend to truncate it, because we need chapters, or we need a particular way to see it. Like you said, the normative narrative or the larger narrative. And that narrative gives us the 1920s, the gay 20s, or, it's got the flappers, but it doesn't have Black people in it. It doesn't have Marcus Garvey in it, who's visiting North Carolina, to a packed house, even though he's going to be, out on bail and they're raising money for him. This is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Mm-hmm. And so, and Marcus Garvey is going to come to town. Now, of course, he couldn't have come to town if the white people didn't want him to come to town. So, which is an interesting narrative in and of itself. And of course, Marcus Garvey came there, and he didn't have the same kind of narrative that he had previously. So he was palatable for the white community. So there's that. And then Winston-Salem is also developing in other ways. And Mary McLeod Bethune, who had, would become such a major player in education, is also going to become a major player in club work, right? Club women's work. And so she's going to become president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And then she'll later, by the 1930s, develop the National Council of Negro Women. Madie Hall Xuma is sort of following that trajectory as well. And as I said, Mary McLeod Bethune herself was a white woman, WCA. So she's not necessarily following in Mary McLeod Bethune footsteps, because she didn't know as much about Mary McLeod Bethune early on. But they would develop the Black Y in Winston-Salem. But you can see her in the 1920s. She's not becoming a flapper, but she is becoming a modern woman, a modern Black American woman She's driving. I mean, she starts driving when she's when she's in her teens. She learns how to drive, but she's driving. She's riding a train by herself. She's doing all kinds of things. She's also ultimately will be helping to take care of her mother who will have a stroke. So it is, and then she'll become, the general secretary of the YWCA. So all of that is happening in the 1920s, and we don't talk about the 1920s in that way. Even when I taught U.S. history, I talked about some African Americans, but it's also American history was way bigger than what we gave it credit for in the 1920s. We talk about the Al Capones and all that other stuff. We don't talk about these African Americans who were just as important in their communities and what they did during that time period. And then we sort of talk about it. We do all this sort of gay 20s and what was happening, and the stock market was up and then it crashes. And then it's like, okay, then we have the Depression. And the Depression itself doesn't always include Black people, which is fascinating to me. It's like, how do you not include Black people? They were the poorest of the poor. And so, but Madie at this time is going to leave Winston-Salem, and she's going to go to Columbia University. And that history is striking, because people like her will go up there and they'll come back south to the Jim Crow South, like her. And so the question becomes, what does that mean, actually? That they go to New York, they are educated there because they can't get their master's degrees in the South. And they can't go to, primarily because they can't go to predominantly white colleges and universities, and they didn't have, master's programs for African Americans in the South and these historically Black colleges, or what we call historically Black colleges. So what exactly does that mean, that they're traversing, going up to New York and they're coming back, being educated in a particular pedagogy, educational pedagogy? So what does that mean? And I don't know if the education people may have delved into it more, but I'm not real sure historians in particular have really looked at that and how that shapes the narrative, particularly, during and after World War II and the civil rights movement itself.
And before she goes to New York, and you said she goes back to WSSU to school, but it's an interesting quote that you have in there where she said when she went and talked to, by then S.G. Atkins had passed away at that particular point when she went back. Am I correct? I think, and then his son, was it his son or son, the president? I forget that.
That's
little
going to be in
transition.
the 1930s.
Yeah.
And the son's going to take over.
Right. And so she communicated and says that I want to go back to school. And she says that, I want to go back to school, but I don't want to go to high school. Right. I'm not going to. And then, of course, he looks at the transcript and said, oh, well, you done already. And then
she knew how many years she'd been out of school.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, but I don't want to do that. Right. All over again.
And also she expanded her knowledge base in the organizing and the connections. And she had a lifetime experience that she was able to do. So that quote was very interesting. And she gets to New York. She's now moving into this internationalism, the Kimbrough. She meets the Kimbroughs. She meets an early Max Yergin. Of course, Max Yergin is a very interesting character on his own who becomes anti-communist. And, he's part of the African, the Council of African Affairs with Du Bois and Robeson and Alpheus Huntington. She meets an early Max Yergin. But the Kimbroughs, when she gets to New York, is there internationalization. And in New York, and just to kind of, I'm kind of looking at time. I don't want to make sure I take care of your time as well. She meets A.B. Xuma, right? And then let's talk about, now we're pivoting. Now she gets her master's degree. She's in New York. She ends up going back down, as you say, to the South, along with a number of other folk who are doing the same thing. At the same time, there's an internationalization. She's very clear about Africa, again, through the work that she's doing with the organizations that she joins, even while she's in New York. There's an internationalization. There's a focus on Africa. Max Yergin, of course, has already been, did a lot of work in South Africa. The Kimbroughs are there in New York, kind of fashion. We're now pivoting now into this entry point. This is her entry point, particularly into going to South Africa. New York, she goes back down to Winston. There was some controversy. One of the homes that it was constructed, there was some controversy that happened there. She moves then, of course, into to South Africa. And I'm trying to kind of truncate this because we want people to get the book. There's a lot here. But let's go ahead and New York, but let's skip to South Africa. She meets A.B. Xuma in New York. They develop this correspondence. They begin to talk a little bit more about that entry point into South Africa.
New York, I called it the bridge to apartheid. Right. And that's exactly what it is. It's between Jim Crow and apartheid, actually. And so, Jim Crow is Winston-Salem or the South. And then she moves to this very cosmopolitan city. Even during the Depression, it's still cosmopolitan. We've got people from all over the world. And she goes to International House. I mean, she lives there. She's going to Columbia University, but she's also living at the International House. And so she is already engaged with people from around the world. So it expands her world. Alfred Xuma comes to, he had been educated at Tuskegee. He left South Africa, even though apartheid as we know it and as we define it had not existed in South Africa yet. It's going to come in 1948, but racism was rampant in South Africa. And so, and I think that's what people forget. And so he comes here and he goes to Tuskegee. What I learned about writing this, I was surprised there were Black Cubans who came to Tuskegee. I was stunned. So I learned a lot while I was doing it, and how popular Tuskegee was around the world. So I had no idea. So anyway, he had gone to Tuskegee, graduated, and then he ended up in, several places, but he would end up in Chicago, and he would, or Evanston, and he would graduate from Northwestern University, get his medical degree. And it was not easy for him. He too was like Madie Xowa. He was very service oriented. He always knew he didn't care how long he was going to be in the United States. He was always going back to South Africa. There was never a question. He always knew he was going back, as he said, to help his people. So all the knowledge that he was gaining here, he was taking back. And he was here for a very long time. It was over a decade. So he gets his medical degree at Northwestern University through some help from the African Methodist Episcopal Church, white African Methodist Episcopals, to help him. But it was his own work that kept him in school and, kept him going, because he had a really, really rough time. So he is invited to come and give a presentation in New York. First at the International House, and then later he's gonna be, an invitation from one person, I believe. He actually gives a talk, maybe meets him there. And then he's gonna come back in a much bigger capacity, because he's now a big kahuna in South Africa. He'd sort of been on the end in the first place, when he first went back, because everybody was sort of looking to him. And so he now is one of the major people. You're right, he knows Max Jurgen, and I always ask people, do they know who Max Jurgen is? And nobody knows him. There's a wonderful biography of him, and I use the author's biography, whose name is escaping me at the moment, and I'm sorry for that. But I used his biography a lot, and he is a very interesting character. He also went to Shaw University. So, and his wife, Susie Jurgen, also went to Shaw University as well, hence the historically Black colleges again. So, and Paul Robeson, the actor, it's really stunning and an activist. And then there's Du Bois, who is hosting Alfred B. Xuma. Du Bois is larger than life, and for all of us. And here he is hosting Alfred B. Xuma in New York. He and Lawrence Redding. It's like, really? So all of these connections that I've written about in my in previous works, and I've talked about, and to see them all sort of come back to life in this woman who was born in the Jim Crow South's life. So New York becomes the bridge in that way, because it offers her the opportunity to leave Jim Crow, to go north, to get educated. She goes back south. But then she had met Alfred B. Xuma in New York, And as I've said before, he just became enamored with her. Now, we need to keep in mind that he was looking for a wife. And I'll have people can read the book for the details. They're quite interesting, but he wasn't looking, and he enlisted his friends to help him to find him a wife. He had been married before. His wife and Madie Hall Xuma actually have a lot in common, and that is their commitment to service. And they have, just and their own personalities. His wife had gone to school here in the United States as well. And so, but she, was from Liberia. So that part is fascinating, that he in so many ways found a woman who was very similar to his first wife, but he was also a father, and his first wife they'd had 2 children. And so the other part that I don't discuss much, and I did it on purpose, because the children were off limits for me. And so, except, I have minor things in there, but they were really off limits for me. So Madie becomes a mother once she agrees to marry Alfred B. Xuma, at the age of 45. So, she's not a spring chicken, and she's becoming a mother for the first time. So, and it's really the only mother that they truly have ever known, because they were so young when their mother died. So, but she meets him, and he, like I said, he was I say smitten. That might be too mild of a word, because he decided he just zeroing in on her, and this was it. She wasn't so enamored with him. I think she was, it's clear that she was really into what he was doing. She admired him and respected him and his commitment to service and to his people in South Africa. That she understood, and she was gung-ho. But the part about marrying him was a whole nother story. So I'll leave that to people to be able to read, because I had to put that in there. I wasn't at first, but she sounded like a crazy woman. So I had to talk about why this all happened and how it evolved. So it's a very detailed about how all of this evolved. And ultimately, you see a woman who's conflicted, but comes to a conclusion that this is the right thing for her to do. So, and she goes to South Africa she gets on a ship. And as I've said many times before, she gets on a ship at the time when the European war is happening. And so the Germans are blowing ships up, out of the ocean. And she has to get permission from the United States. The first time she was supposed to leave, she couldn't. The government told her, nope, she wasn't going because it was too dangerous. And so she, but ultimately they do open up a passage for her to go over. And she sails over to Cape Town, and she actually marries him in Cape Town. And so she went on her adventure. And that's one reason why I had to do that whole chapter on how they got together, because this sounds wacky. It's like, who would get on a ship in the middle of a war and go over to marry a man from South Africa? So they get married. It was a weird sort of ceremony, all of it. I'll leave that to people to read. It was a calamity, actually. But they built a life that is, they were the it couple. They became not only in South Africa, but really globally. And it's hard to imagine them having been in that space and for us to have forgotten that. And so he recognized in her, in many ways, his own attributes. He had them, and he saw in her those same kinds of attributes: service to the people, a recognition that it was her job to reach back and down or up or whatever to help people. And that's exactly what she did. And so they would, he would become president of the African National Congress several months after they got married. So it's clear they discussed it. And then she would become president of the African National Congress's Women's League. She's the only Black American woman who has ever been president of the African National Congress Women's League. And by the way, at the same time, the women in the ANC get the right to vote within the organization itself. So it is a remarkable story, one in which we if we reduce her only to, this little weird woman who married Afro-Beats Zuma and was just his wife, then we can't see who she really was and what she actually did in South Africa. So she, again, that thread of the why. So the why comes back up as well. And her creating the Zenzele clubs and joining it to the World YWCA.
And with that, I think we've done a lot of teasing.
Yes.
And we definitely, like I said, I really want to, for some reason, like my producer in me is like, okay, now let's pause the conversation, because now this opens up, because when folk get the book, this period of her life becomes very important, because of course she's very involved in a global context and global women's activism, and really, again, reaches back out to Mary McLeod Bethune and develops the connection between African descendant women here and South African women. Now, again, this is not without controversy, because there's some people whispering like, why did he go marry this, African American? So there's things there. But again, you would have to get the book in order to do that, in order to really get a real clear. I wanted to, as we pause the conversation, I don't like to say stop or conclude, but as we pause the conversation, is there something that you would like to leave the listeners with, to tease them a little bit more, to encourage them to go? This is a wonderful book. I cannot begin to tell you, like, it's very rare. I usually read sometimes 2 books at a time, not because I'm some type of genius, because I get bored very easily. And so when I'm reading one book, it's easier for me to jump to another book to kind of keep me interested. Not, I don't want to give the false impression that I'm some type of genius or something like that. I just get bored easy. But I will say, this book, I picked it up and I didn't put it down, because it was just such a fascinating, and you did such a deep dive, in recovering, history, helping us remember history. I don't like to say things are lost or things, you really help us to remember and pointed us in different ways. Scholars who are going to pick up this book, young folk who are going to pick this book up, see a lot of extensions that they can go in, a lot of paths, a lot of things that they can go into. But again, I want to be quiet for now. Is there anything that you would like, as we kind of can put a pin in the conversation, and I do want to honor your time as well, that you would like to leave our listeners with?
The only thing I could say, I think, is for me, even as a scholar of Black women's history, I realized that I, as many people do, want to make, and I know why, want to make Black women activists. We just want them to be activists. They have no private life. They had no life before, or they were simply born in some place and then they left, or, they did this and then they became activists. And I wanted this book to really reflect the complexity of her life. And I'm hopeful that I did that. And that's why I began with Winston Salem. Because Winston Salem itself was a complex place. And that first chapter, the making of Madie Beatrice Hall, is exactly that. She could not have become who she was without having the parents that she had, being engaged in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. It could have been any other church that also believed in service or whatever. And the Black community that surrounded her, the schools, the Simon Atkinses of the world. And so it was that community, in addition to her parents and led by her parents, that made her who she was and could lead her and help guide her, even though they had died, in South Africa. That she would go to a place where she didn't speak, many of the native languages, that she could go to a place where, as you hinted at, some of the people wondered, well, why couldn't you find an African woman, a South African woman? Why do you have to go find this Black American woman? And were suspicious of her. That she could win them over. That when she went out in the villages, because somebody's asked, well, what about, her Christianity? Did it bump up against it? And I told them I couldn't really answer that, because she kept winning people over. I'm sure she certainly had critics, but she was always winning people over, and she tried her best. And also, I think it was her personality. So I made her complex. Because she is, like all of us are. We're not one-dimensional, but we often write biography, I think, as this one-dimensional sort of space. And I think for particularly Black women, because we need them to be active, because they've got to be fighting against something. And so I wanted to put that chapter, although I was afraid and didn't know how to do it, and it took me a long time, the chapter on their courtship in there, because I needed people to see her as a human being, a older woman, but a woman who was conflicted, who first told him, nope, not marrying you, I don't know why you're asking me this, and then came to a conclusion that she wanted an adventure, and as you can see at the end, who also truly loved him. Because that's always the question as well. Was this a marriage of convenience? Or was it, and it's not clear to me that she loved him like he apparently was, enamored with her at the beginning, but it's very clear that they loved each other. And if nothing else, that's one of the most important things that I want people to come away with here, that she was really the complicated person that she had to be in order to have grown up in Jim Crow and watched apartheid come. It comes in 1948. She moves to South Africa in 1940. And she is watching, that scene where she gets off the plane and, he's picking her up and apartheid has just been instituted. In and of itself it's just amazing, because as I was writing, I was like, okay, this is really interesting. I don't know if it really looked like this, but he picks her up at the airport. She had just left Jim Crow, watching the walls of Jim Crow tumble, and she goes to apartheid. So the gist of this is I'm hopeful that people see her as the complicated character that I tried to make her, and that she was not one-dimensional, because none of us are. And we all have these internal conflicts, and she had them as well. And I'm hopeful that I did her justice. Being the first major biography of her, Iris Berger has the article, but the first major biography of her, I'm hopeful that I did her justice.
You absolutely did, and also, you placed her and her husband in the context or in the conversation. Esther Cooper Jackson and James Jackson, Icelander Robeson, and of course Paul Robeson, Shirley Graham Du Bois and Du Bois. So you've placed, you've done a wonderful job in giving those who will be interested, of course, after they hear this and hear other things and other interesting presentations that you've given and you will be giving, but also to really expand. Again, I opened up our conversation with understanding that the breadth and depth of what we call Black history or African American or Africana history is very deep, and the connections are very, very important to map. Again, thank you so much for spending time. Again, you can imagine I got my notebook of notes. I have my book all annotated, but again, I wanted us to at least get to a particular point to pause. From now, it's up to our listeners to take it from here. So again, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Well, thank you so very much for asking me to be a part of this. And of course, always, I'm happy to talk about Madie also as much as possible and introduce as many people to her as I can.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. Follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. Instagram at Africa World Now Project. Access to our other media platforms can be reached through the bios of our social media. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Mwiza Muntali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funa Ngonda, Senior Research, Content Contributor, and Production Director, Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui. Senior Research, Content Contributor, and Production Associate, Dr. Josh Myers. Associate Producer and Content Contributor, Dr. Keisha Khan Perry. Content Contributor and Filmmaker, Kurt Orderson. Technology Advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technologies. And Creative Directors, International Creative and Artist Designer, Tabassum Siddiqui and Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project can be heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Programs are archived and available on all podcast platforms. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.